Part 1. The Betrayal in Motion. The call came just as I was folding the laundry. Michael's name flashed on my phone, and for a moment, I debated letting it go to voicemail. But I answered, sliding into that familiar rhythm of a wife playing the supportive role. "Landed safely," he said. His voice laced with the kind of charm that used to make me weak in the knees. "The weather here's terrible, though. Miss you already." I forced a smile, even though he couldn't see it. "Miss you too. Work hard, okay?" "Always," he said before hanging up. As I set the phone down, my gaze wandered to the stack of mail on the counter. It sat on top of a heap of clutter. A stray sock, a crumpled receipt from his last trip to Chicago. I grabbed the receipt, more out of an instinct to tidy up than anything else, but the bold line item at the bottom stopped me cold. "Dinner for two, La Vie and Rose." I stared at it for longer than I'd care to admit. La Vie and Rose wasn't the kind of place Michael and I frequented. It was the kind of place you reserved for anniversaries or affairs. The blood drained from my face as a dozen memories and suspicions came rushing back. The late nights, the sudden gym memberships, the text messages he brushed off as just work. The sick irony of it all was that I'd suspected something for months but had convinced myself I was being paranoid. Yet here was the proof, sitting in my hand like a grenade waiting to explode. I couldn't confront him, not yet. Michael was a master of deflection, always ready with an excuse. "You're being ridiculous," he'd say, or worse, he'd turn it on me, claiming I was the one overreacting. Instead, I sat down and poured myself a glass of wine, letting the weight of it all sink in. How long had it been since Michael and I had felt connected? I couldn't pinpoint it exactly. Maybe it was after his promotion when he started traveling more. Maybe it was when he stopped noticing the little things like how I dyed my hair or rearranged the living room. The worst part was how lonely I felt, even when he was home. We drifted apart so subtly that I didn't realize how wide the gap had become, until I was staring at this stupid receipt. My phone buzzed on the counter, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was Ben, Michael's younger brother. "Hey Sarah. Everything okay?" Ben was always checking in, always quick to lend an ear or crack a joke to lighten the mood. There was something comforting about him, something Michael had lost years ago. I hesitated before replying, but then I thought, why not? If Michael could have his secrets, why couldn't I? I called him back, and his familiar voice came through, warm and reassuring. "Hey, what's up?" "Not much," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "Just needed someone to talk to." Ben was quiet for a moment, then said, "Want some company? I can swing by. I've got nothing going on tonight." It wasn't unusual for him to visit. He and Michael were close, and over the years, he'd become a kind of extended family. But tonight his offer felt different. "Sure," I said, the words slipping out before I could think better of it. As I hung up, a small voice in the back of my head whispered that I was playing with fire. But in that moment I didn't care. If Michael was out there living his double life, maybe it was time I took a step towards something unexpected. And so, with the receipt still sitting on the counter like an accusation, I opened a second bottle of wine and waited for Ben to arrive. Part 2. The setup. When Ben arrived, it felt like a breath of fresh air had blown into the house. He came through the door with his usual easy confidence, carrying a bottle of red wine in one hand and a bag of takeout in the other. "I didn't know what you were in the mood for, so I got your favorite pad thai and spring rolls," he said, flashing that signature grin. My chest warmed at his thoughtfulness. "You didn't have to do that," I said, though I was already grabbing plates from the cupboard. "Well, you sounded like you needed a pick-me-up," he replied, plopping onto the couch like he'd been living here all his life. That was Ben, completely at ease wherever he went. We settled in with the food, the wine flowing a little too easily as we talked about everything and nothing. Ben had a way of making conversation effortless. He joked about the terrible blind date he'd been on recently, complete with impressions of his date's nasal laugh, and I found myself laughing so hard my cheeks hurt. "Seriously though," he said, his tone shifting slightly, "what's going on with you? You seemed off on the phone earlier." I hesitated, swirling the wine in my glass. How much could I say without tipping my hand? I couldn't exactly unload the truth. "Hey Ben, I think your brother's cheating on me, and I invited you over because I'm lonely and a little drunk." Instead I said, "It's nothing really. Just feeling a little out of sorts lately." Ben studied me for a moment, his playful demeanor replaced by a quieter, more serious energy. "Michael doesn't deserve you, you know," he said softly. I froze. "What do you mean by that?" He shrugged, leaning back against the couch. "Just, he takes you for granted." Always has. Anyone with eyes can see it. The words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't like I hadn't thought the same thing before, but hearing it from Ben of all people made it feel real. I looked at him trying to read his expression. Was he just being protective? Or was there something more to his words? The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. Anyway, he said, breaking the tension with a small smile. You deserve better, that's all. I didn't know what to say, so I poured us both another glass of wine. The conversation shifted back to lighter topics, his plans for the weekend, the ridiculous TV shows he'd been binging. But the undercurrent of that moment lingered. By the time we finished eating, the wine had loosened me up enough that I felt bold, even reckless. Do you want to stay for a while? Watch a movie or something? I asked, trying to sound casual. Ben hesitated, glancing at the clock. I don't know. It's getting late. Come on, I pressed, the wine emboldening me. You can't leave me alone with this half-empty bottle. Besides, I need someone to help me make fun of bad horror movies. He laughed, relenting. All right, but if it's one of those slasher flicks where the killer wears a hockey mask, I'm out. We settled onto the couch, the TV casting a dim glow across the room. Somewhere between the first jump scare and the cheesy dialogue, I realized how close we were sitting. His arm brushed mine and I felt a spark, a jolt of something I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was just the wine, just the thrill of having someone paying attention to me for a change. But when I looked over at Ben, his eyes met mine, and there was something there. Something unspoken but undeniable. For the first time that night, I felt like I wasn't teetering on the edge of a cliff. I was already falling. And as the credits rolled on the movie, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop. Part 3, Crossing the Line. The movie ended, but neither of us moved. The screen went dark, leaving only the faint hum of the TV, and the dim glow of the streetlights streaming through the curtains. Ben was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him. My heart raced and I tried to convince myself it was just the wine. Just the fleeting comfort of someone filling the emptiness Michael had left behind. But the way Ben looked at me told a different story. This was fun, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm glad I came over. I nodded, unable to speak. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out every rational thought. I knew I should get up, create some distance, do anything to diffuse the tension building between us. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned closer, so close that I could see the flecks of green in his hazel eyes. Me too, I murmured, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His gaze dropped to my lips for the briefest moment, and that was all it took. The space between us disappeared in an instant, and his lips were on mine. The kiss started tentatively, almost hesitant, like we were both testing the waters. But it quickly deepened, and all the guilt, the anger, and the loneliness I'd been bottling up spilled out in that moment. His hands cradled my face, his touch gentle yet urgent, and I felt my body melt into his as if it had been waiting for this all along. A million thoughts raced through my mind. This is Michael's brother. This is wrong. This is revenge. But louder than all of them was the simple truth that I hadn't felt this alive in years. Sarah, Ben whispered against my lips, his voice laced with a mix of desire and hesitation. We shouldn't. I know. I cut him off, pulling him closer. But I don't care. He hesitated for a moment, his forehead resting against mine as he closed his eyes. I could feel the conflict radiating off him, the tug-of-war between loyalty to his brother and the undeniable connection we just crossed into. But when his lips found mine again, any reservations he had seemed to vanish. Before I knew it, we were tangled together on the couch, the world outside the walls of my living room fading away. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about Michael or the unanswered questions about his fidelity. I wasn't thinking about the consequences or the fallout. I was only thinking about Ben, his touch, his scent, the way his hands traced lines down my back as if he'd been waiting just as long as I had. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and tangled in each other's arms, reality started to creep back in. The silence was deafening, and I could feel the weight of what we'd just done settling over us like a storm cloud. Ben ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mixture of guilt and longing. Sarah, don't, I said quickly, shaking my head. Let's just not talk about it. Not right now. He nodded, though the tension in his jaw was impossible to miss. I should go, he said quietly, standing and grabbing his coat. I wanted to ask him to stay, to pretend for just a little while longer that this was okay. But I knew I couldn't. As he walked to the door he turned back, his eyes searching mine. It wasn't just you, you know? I wanted it too. I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. When the door clicked shut behind him, I sank back onto the couch, my mind spinning. The room felt colder, emptier without him there. And as the guilt began to settle in, I couldn't help but wonder what I'd just set in motion, and whether there was any way to stop it before everything came crashing down. Part 4: The Fallout. The morning light seeped through the curtains, unforgiving and far too bright. I sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, replaying the events of the previous night in my mind. I could still feel the warmth of Ben's touch, his kiss lingering on my lips. But with each passing minute, the glow of the moment dimmed, replaced by an icy knot of guilt tightening in my chest. What had I done? My phone buzzed, jolting me from my thoughts. I grabbed it instinctively, my heart leaping when I saw Ben's name on the screen. "We need to talk," the text read. I stared at the words, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend nothing had happened. But I knew that wasn't an option. Ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. It would only fester, growing into something even more unmanageable. I typed back a quick response. "Come over." The hours crawled by as I waited, each minute stretching into an eternity. When I heard the knock at the door, my stomach flipped. I opened it to find Ben standing there, looking like he hadn't slept either. His hair was disheveled, and the usual lightness in his expression was gone, replaced by a storm of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Hey," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. We stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of the previous night hanging heavy between us. Finally, Ben broke the silence. "Sarah, we need to figure out what this means," he said, running a hand through his hair. "What happens now?" I sank onto the couch, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did." He sat down beside me, his hands clasped tightly together. "I know, but it did happen. And now we're here." I looked at him, searching for some kind of answer in his face. "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know," he said finally. "I mean, part of me feels like I should. Michael's my brother and what we did." He trailed off, shaking his head. "But another part of me, I don't regret being with you, Sarah. Not for a second." His words were like a balm to my conflicted heart, but they also made everything more complicated. "Michael doesn't get to play the victim here," I said, my voice hardening. "He's been lying to me for months, Ben. I found receipts, texts, all the signs. He's the one who broke our vows, not me." Ben's jaw tightened. "You're sure about this? About him cheating?" "Yes," I said, the bitterness creeping into my voice. "And the worst part? He doesn't even care enough to hide it. He just assumes I'll never look, never question anything." Ben leaned back, exhaling sharply. "If that's true, then he's a bigger idiot than I thought. He doesn't deserve you, Sarah." The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache. For a moment I let myself imagine a world where things were different, where I wasn't married to Michael, where Ben wasn't his brother, where the lines weren't so impossibly tangled. "What are we supposed to do now?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of the question. Ben rubbed the back of his neck, his expression pained. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know I can't keep this from him forever. He's my brother, Sarah. If he finds out from someone else." "Finds out what?" a voice interrupted. We both froze, turning toward the doorway. There stood Michael, his suitcase still in hand, his expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. My heart plummeted into my stomach. "I got an earlier flight," Michael said, his eyes darting between Ben and me. "What's going on?" Panic clawed at my throat. "Nothing," I said quickly, too quickly. Michael's eyes narrowed. "Doesn't look like nothing." Ben stood, his posture stiff. "I was just leaving," he said, his voice strained. As he brushed past Michael on his way out, I saw the faintest flicker of something in Michael's expression, doubt, maybe even jealousy. When the door closed behind Ben, Michael turned back to me, his gaze sharp. "Care to explain why my brother was here?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The truth was hovering on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Instead, I reached for the safest lie I could think of. "He was just checking in on me," I said, forcing a smile. "You know how he is." Michael studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right," he said. though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. As he walked upstairs, I let out a shaky breath, my heart still racing. Ben was right. We couldn't keep this secret forever. And when it came out, it wouldn't just break Michael's trust, it would shatter everything. Part 5: Confessions. The hours after Michael's unexpected return felt like a slow-burning fuse. I went through the motions, setting the table for dinner, listening to him recount his business trip, but I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. His questions about Ben lingered in the air, unspoken but ever-present. That night, after Michael had fallen asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about Ben, about the way he'd looked at me earlier, torn between loyalty and something deeper. I thought about Michael, blissfully unaware, or so I thought, of the cracks in our carefully constructed life. And most of all, I thought about myself. How had I let things spiral this far out of control? The next day Ben texted, "We need to talk." I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop on the other side of town. It felt safer, less conspicuous, than having him come back to the house. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a coffee in front of him, untouched. "You came," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. "Of course I did," I replied, though my voice lacked conviction. "We need to figure this out." Ben nodded, but his expression was grim. "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about what we did, about what it means. And," I prompted, my heart pounding. "And I don't regret it," he admitted, his voice low. "But I can't keep living like this. I can't look Michael in the eye knowing what I've done." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we have two options," he said, leaning forward. "Either we tell him the truth and deal with the fallout, or we end this now and pretend it never happened." The thought of confessing made my stomach churn. I pictured Michael's face, the betrayal in his eyes, the inevitable explosion that would follow. But the idea of ending things with Ben felt equally unbearable. "I don't know if I can do either," I admitted, my voice trembling. Ben reached across the table, his hand brushing mine. "Sarah, I care about you. More than I should. But we can't keep lying to ourselves. This isn't sustainable." I pulled my hand away. Not because I didn't want his comfort, but because I didn't know what to do with it. "What about Michael?" I asked. "What about what he's done to me?" Ben frowned. "I don't doubt he's hurt you, Sarah. But we don't know the full story. If he's cheating, then yes, he's a bastard. But if we're wrong..." I shook my head. "I'm not wrong. I've seen the proof." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then why not confront him? Why not get the truth out in the open?" As I was scared. Scared of what I'd find. Scared of how it would upend my life. And, if I was honest, scared of losing whatever fragile connection I had with Ben. "I need time," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ben looked at me, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe, or regret. "Time isn't going to fix this, Sarah. It's only going to make it worse." I knew he was right, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. As I drove home, his words echoed in my mind. Time wasn't my ally here, it was my enemy. And yet, I found myself clinging to it, hoping against hope that it would somehow give me the clarity I so desperately needed. When I walked through the door, Michael was waiting for me. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just running errands," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, but the look on his face told me he didn't believe me. "You seem distracted lately," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm fine," I said quickly, brushing past him. But as I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I felt his gaze following me, heavy with suspicion. That night, I lay in bed next to him, the space between us feeling like a chasm. I thought about Ben, about his ultimatum, and about the ticking clock I could almost hear in the silence. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. Something had to give, and soon. Part 6. The aftermath. The days that followed felt like living in a pressure cooker, the heat steadily rising with no release. Every interaction with Michael felt strained, his usual indifference replaced by a quiet intensity that set my nerves on edge. And Ben was a ghost. No calls, no texts, no unexpected visits. It was as if he'd vanished entirely, leaving me alone to wrestle with the storm we'd created. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, Michael walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, watching me in silence. I tried to focus on chopping vegetables, but his presence was suffocating. "Is there something you want to tell me, Sarah?" he asked finally, his tone measured. I froze, my hand tightening around the knife. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, but his eyes bore into mine. I don't know. You've been acting off lately. And Ben hasn't been around. Did something happen? My heart raced, a dozen lies fighting to spill out at once. But before I could respond, he added, because if there's something I should know, now would be the time to say it. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Instead, I turned back to the cutting board, my hands trembling as I resumed chopping. Michael sighed, pushing off the counter. Fine, he said, his voice clipped. If you won't talk to me, maybe I'll ask Ben. The words sent a jolt of panic through me. Michael, wait. But he was already walking away, his phone in hand. That night I sat alone at the dining table, the untouched dinner growing cold in front of me. Michael didn't come back and I didn't dare call him. I felt like a prisoner awaiting her sentence, the walls closing in with every tick of the clock. When he finally returned, it was past midnight. His face was unreadable as he sat across from me, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, or something darker. I talked to Ben, he said, his voice flat. My breath caught. And he studied me for a long moment, his gaze piercing. He didn't tell me anything, he said finally. But he didn't have to. The way he hesitated, the way he avoided my questions. It was enough. Michael, don't, he interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. Don't insult me by lying anymore. I'm not an idiot, Sarah. I know something happened between you two. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a physical force. I didn't mean for it to happen, I said finally, my voice trembling. I was hurt, Michael. Lonely. And after everything. After all the nights you were gone, all the lies, all the other women. He flinched, his jaw tightening. You don't get to turn this around on me, he said coldly. Whatever I did, or didn't do, doesn't justify what you did. Maybe not, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. But it happened. And I can't take it back. Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment I thought he might leave again, but instead, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. I don't know what happens next, he said quietly. But this isn't something we come back from. And with that, he walked away, leaving me alone in the dimly lit kitchen, the shattered pieces of our marriage scattered around me. Days later, the fallout was swift and brutal. Michael moved into a hotel to figure things out, leaving me with an empty house and an ache I couldn't shake. Ben reached out once, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. What was there to say? That I'd ruined everything? That I didn't know how to fix it? Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a strange, lonely rhythm. I thought about Ben often, about Michael even more. I replayed every choice, every mistake, wondering when exactly I'd lost control. And then one day a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Michael, short and to the point. I'm filing for divorce. I hope you find what you're looking for. I stared at the words until they blurred, the finality of it all sinking in. Infidelity is rarely black and white. Do you think Sarah's actions were justified, given Michael's suspected cheating? Or do two wrongs never make a right? And what about Ben? Was his betrayal of his brother unforgivable? Or was he just caught in a web of complicated emotions? Let's talk about it. What would you have done?